Medical doctor and theologian M.R. DeHaan, whose portrait, by the way, hangs in our Christian Hall of Fame, he said, and I quote, "The Bible is a book of blood, wholly distinct from all other books for just one reason, namely that it contains blood circulating through every page and in every verse. From Genesis to Revelation, we see the stream of blood." End of quote. That is by Dr. DeHaan. Well, he was absolutely right. The Bible is, as he puts it, a book of blood. From the very first book of the Bible to the last book of the Bible, there is a trail of blood that winds its way through the pages, revealing to us the story of God's redemption for lost humanity. I draw your attention to three words found in Hebrews 9 and verse 7. And I am going to acknowledge that this is a springboard text, and we are going to make our way from Genesis all the way to Revelation here tonight. But in Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 7, you find these three words: not without blood. Do you see that there? Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 7. You ought to underline them or circle them in your Bible. But those three words again, not without blood. My goal in this first message is to show by way of the Scriptures the truth of those three words, not without blood, and then to give you several important thoughts concerning the blood here tonight in this message. I want us to go all the way back to the Old Testament. And let's start with the book of Genesis. Go, if you will, to Genesis chapter 4. Because I want us to see what the Bible teaches about the blood in four different areas. The first area is going to be the Old Testament. And in Genesis chapter 4, we find the first account of a man making a sacrificial blood offering, and that man's name is Abel. You remember that Adam and Eve had two sons, right? Cain and Abel. Abel is the one who offered a blood sacrifice offering. And we see it in Genesis chapter 4 and verse 4. And Abel, he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering. Now, this is a very significant verse because it gives us the first act of worship recorded in the Bible. And it's important to note that blood was shed and a sacrifice was made unto God. Now, the lesson to be learned here in Genesis 4 and verse 4 is that we cannot approach God, we cannot have fellowship with God apart from the blood, right? That's what we see here as a spiritual lesson for us in Genesis chapter 4 and verse 4 with the story about Abel offering as an act of worship that sacrificial blood offering. We cannot approach God. We cannot have intimate fellowship with God without the blood. We learn from Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 4 that it was by faith that Abel offered an acceptable sacrifice. Now, that expression by faith tells us that Abel was a believer. Hebrews 11 verse 4 reads like this: "By faith Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, by which he obtained witness that he was righteous." And so we see the first blood sacrifice being made in Genesis chapter 4. Now, move on, if you will, to Genesis chapter 6 and chapter 7 and chapter 8. Because here we find the account of Noah and the flood, a story that we have heard all the way back from our Sunday school days. We know that the worldwide flood was God's judgment on man's sin. But after the waters subside, you find these words in Genesis 8 and verse 20. Turn, if you will, to chapter 8 and verse 20. "And Noah builded an altar unto the Lord, and took of every clean beast, and of every clean fowl, and offered" what? "Burnt offerings on the altar. And so here we see Noah making a sacrificial blood offering to God upon the altar. Now, after Noah, the next prominent character that we find in the book of Genesis is a man named Abraham. You find God's divine call upon his life and also God's covenant with him in Genesis chapter 12. You know the story, and we can't rehearse all the story about Abraham, but about the miraculous birth of his son Isaac. And also, God promised to Abraham that through Isaac there would become a great nation of people, namely the nation of Israel. But then you come to Genesis 22. So go, if you will, all the way to Genesis chapter 22, where Abraham faced the greatest test of his life. God asked Abraham to go up Mount Moriah and to sacrifice his only son, Isaac. In what I would describe as an incredible act of faith, Abraham obediently takes Isaac and he heads up Mount Moriah. He binds Isaac, he lays Isaac on the altar, and then he raises his knife high into the air, ready obediently to offer his son as a sacrifice. But just in the nick of time, the angel of the Lord stops him and says this in Genesis chapter 22, "Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him, for now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me." And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for what? A burnt offering in the stead of his son. But Isaac was spared, and the ram was offered as a sacrifice in his place.